Well, let's talk about the Prime Minister now, because last night Mark Carney did give that primetime address outlining the goals he is hoping to achieve with his upcoming budget. That includes an ambitious trade goal, specifically aiming to double the amount of goods exported by Canada to countries outside the United States. And later this week, the Prime Minister will leave for a 9-day trip to Asia, where he will attend the meeting of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, as well as a meeting of APEC to talk about relationships and trade. And to dig into this, we're now joined by Shachi Kurl, president of the Angus Reid Institute. Shachi, nice to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure to be with you, Michael.
So you've been doing some polling looking into Canadian attitudes when it comes to expanding trade with Asia. And I'll say that we'll get to China and India in a bit, but I wanted to begin with a poll your firm released this afternoon. It focuses in on the Indo-Pacific countries, Southeast Asia, ahead of the ASEAN meeting. And even though Canada is looking for new markets, when you look at the actual ASEAN countries, represented on this graph by Thailand and the Philippines, there seems to be less enthusiasm for seeking trade with ASEAN countries. What's behind that?
Well, it's very much, I think, a sense of familiarity breeds comfort. So what are the regions, who are the economic blocs that we have been pursuing trade with over the last 40, 50 years? Obviously, the United States is right at the top of that list and has been for a long time. Mexico, much more familiar in the post-NAFTA era, which frankly is the lifetimes of most young working trade officials today. And then, of course, looking to the EU, where we already have a free trade agreement. Asian countries, if you're a glass half full person in the PMO these days, coming off of that briefing that the Prime Minister gave to the country, you're saying, hey, look, the good news is there are majorities who look at Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, and Taiwan, and several other APEC/ASEAN nations and say, look, we should approach these countries as potential allies in a friendly way, and they have the potential to be as good a trading partner as any. Where the glass is half empty, frankly, is in the catch-up that Canada has to play in forging broader economic relationships with these nations, in part, again, because a lack of general awareness that Canadians have. And yes, of course, politicians will always say, well, we don't do trade based on public opinion. Fair enough. Fair point, but at the same time, it certainly reflects the mindset. If the general Canadian public isn't really aware of opportunities in these regions, I guarantee you a significant number of MPs in Parliament are also not necessarily aware of, because they're pretty in tune to what their constituents are talking about and thinking about. Mm-hmm. And so there is some catch up to play on that front. There's enough of a blank canvas to make the case to Canadians that these are markets worth pursuing. But I think there's more work to be done in terms of persuading Canadians that these are markets that should be pursued, and pursued perhaps with more urgency than in the past.
Yeah, when you look at the ASEAN countries themselves, they represent about 700 million people, twice the population of the United States. But we're also seeing this government making overtures to both China and India, rebuilding ties, if you will. But obviously, we have had tensions with both those countries. And if you kind of looked at Canadian attitudes around that, how are Canadians feeling about this re-engagement with both the PRC and India?
They have pretty mixed feelings. I think, again, if you're looking for the warmer or more positive takeaways, I think it's notable that 50% of Canadians were supportive of the restoration of the highest level diplomatic relationships between Ottawa and New Delhi. You will both recall that things really hit a low point in Nadir in the face of some pretty serious allegations leveled at Delhi by Canada. But now, both countries have their high commissioners in place. Half the country said, yes, that's a good thing to pursue, whereas only about 25% said, no, this isn't what we should be doing. Only about a quarter said, we don't support this. The rest said they weren't really sure. But at the same time, we still see a significant amount of Canadians, a majority, who say, look, we need to approach India and Delhi in particular around economic ties and around stronger economic alliances With a level of caution. But again, a majority also say they don't know a lot about the Indian economy. They don't know a lot about India beyond sort of what they hear through the lens of diaspora and diaspora concerns. So again, there's room to maneuver for the Carney government, but I think it also needs to be, handled pretty carefully, because this is really just starting to take baby steps for both countries. China, and I'll just add this, Michael.
Yeah.
6-7 years ago, positive views of India were at 56%. They bottomed out a couple of months ago at 26%. So things have been warmer between Canada and India in the Canadian mindset in the past. The question is, can it get back there? In the issue of China, the two Michaels, that epoch, that chapter still looms very, very large in the minds of Canadians. So the level of caution or consternation is going to be higher when it comes to restoring ties between Ottawa and Beijing. However, I think, again, we see in terms of favorability, things really bottomed out when Canadian views of Beijing and the Chinese regime were only at about 9% positive or favorable some years ago. That number is starting to trend upwards. And so much of this, Michael, is really driven by everything that's been happening with the relationship in Washington and south of the border, and Canadians really having to reassess, who are our friends, really, who are our allies, who are our ideal trading partners, and framing questions around how choosy can we be when you look at what's going on south of the border, not just in terms of how bad things have been with the 51st state and tariffs and all of the things that we talk about on a daily basis, but also around things like human rights and rule of law and what we're seeing with ICE agents on the streets of American cities, and Canadians taking a step back going, what is going on here?
Yeah, well, so much so is interesting that we're out of time, but you noted the fact that Canadians are more suspicious right now or concerned about Americans, the United States, than they are with China. So interesting stats as the federal government looks for new trade ties. Listen, Shachi, very interesting polling that you've done as you put up this final board. But we will speak again. This is Shachi Kurl in Vancouver. Thanks, Shachi.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for having me.